Week 13. Today we're going to be talking about sexual health. Sexual health encompasses a number of different things. We're going to be talking about primarily reproductive health today, that's contraception and pregnancy, but sexual health also includes issues of sexuality, sexual pleasure. We'll watch a video about some sexuality terms, and then ethical relationships and sexual choices. In fact, the vast majority of times people have sex, the reason they're doing it is for pleasure and for connection with other people, not related to pregnancy and reproduction. And we'll have a video to watch talking about the orgasm gap later. So I try and give a balanced opinion on most things. I have a strong opinion, however, about abstinence-only education. I think it is unethical. I think it is taxpayer-funded lying to young people, and I think that is wrong. It's a program put out by some pretty extreme religious groups that manage to capture huge amounts of government funding and get in the schools, and they have an agenda about the lifestyle that they believe people should live, and their goal is to push people to that lifestyle. And so in the process of doing that, they are quite happy to provide misinformation and inaccurate information to young people. As a result, it doesn't work, and in fact increases rates of STIs, doesn't help with teen pregnancy. Let me talk about some of the things that it tells you that aren't true. First of all, the core lie that you probably heard is this idea that abstinence is 100% guaranteed, the only guaranteed means of birth control. That's not true, and the reason it's not true is a little counterintuitive, but let me try and explain it. So the way that we rate efficacy of birth control is real-world usage, right? So, for example, the birth control pill, if someone takes it perfectly, if they take it, under lab conditions at exactly the same time every day, if they don't take any other medication or anything that interacts with it, if they never forget one and so forth, then it has very, very high accuracy. The same with condoms. If you use a condom perfectly, if you use it in the lab, they work very well. But of course, in the real world, things go wrong. People forget to take their birth control pill. They take, some other medication that interacts with it poorly. Maybe condoms break. Maybe people put them on incorrectly, and so forth. Right. So the way that we measure birth control is we look at couples that are potentially able to get pregnant and the means of birth control they're using, and whether that means of birth and whether that couple is pregnant at the end of a year that they've been using that method. And abstinence actually doesn't fare very well by that measure. People who intend to use abstinence as their birth control often end up having unprotected sex and end up getting pregnant. Now, if you use it perfectly, then sure, it works, but in the real world, people don't. The actual way to get really effective birth control is to back up your birth control, is to use more than one method, and one of those methods might be abstinence. So, for example, a very effective means of birth control is taking the birth control pill and also intending to be abstinent. People who do that are using two forms of birth control at once. That's a much higher likelihood of working. Using the birth control pill and condoms, abstinence and condoms, whatever combination of birth control methods really makes them a lot more sure, because if one goes wrong, the other one is there to back it up. Okay, we're going to talk now about abortion. Abortion is another taboo topic. It's a topic that's stigmatized. And so it's very common that people, think that no one they know has had an abortion. They think that it's very rare, when in fact it's pretty common. 1 in 4 people who have a uterus have had an abortion in the US by the time they reach menopause. The perception we often have of who has abortions is it's young people who are pregnant for the first time. That's actually a pretty small minority. So 83% of people who have abortions are over 19 years old, and 60% have already given birth to a child. So it's most commonly people who already have children, most commonly somewhat older people. It's also very unevenly distributed by race. 35% of people have abortions are African American. That's compared to something like 10-12% in the population. The number one reason people give for having an abortion is they are unable to support the child financially. And if you put that together with some of the other information, that makes sense, right? So people who already have children and are supporting those children financially often cannot afford to support a second or third or fourth child. And similarly, there is a intersection, of course, between race and poverty in America because of racism causing poverty. And so it's not too surprising that disproportionately people of color have abortions. However, the abortion rate is falling pretty steadily in the US. It's falling pretty steadily actually across administrations, so across presidents who run on pro-choice platforms, the presidents who run on pro-life platforms. Neither side seems to have much effect on the abortion rate, which falls at a fairly steady rate either way. Abortion has had a huge social effect for women, and this relates back to what we were talking about the feminist movement. And I think we often lose sight of this when we talk about the abortion question. We often talk about it in terms of an individual choice, in terms of the ethics of the choice. But I like to think about it sociologically in terms of society. Women, when they're unable to get abortions, often find themselves trapped. They often find themselves trapped in relationships that they need now the father to support them. They often find themselves unable to continue with their career or dedicate as much time to their career as they want to, or to education. Certainly not true for all women with children, but on average, having children, supporting children, tends to mean that women have less time for other activities, which includes activities that gain women power in society, i.e. education, the workplace, and politics. And so the effect of abortion being illegal in the US, which it was in many places for a long time, is that women, as a consequence, tend to have less social power than men do. They tend to be engaging more often in activities that have less social currency, that lead to less power in society. So the fact that abortion is legal in America is a crucial part of increasing equality, increasing women's position in society. And then the last thing I want to know on this slide about abortion is that pregnancy is dangerous. For a long time, pregnancy was a major killer of women. It was very common for women to die in childbirth. That's become less common now with modern medicine, although it is still very unequal, and the maternal mortality rate is significantly higher for African American women. There's extreme health disparities in the US. We'll talk about that more later. So the point here is that the decision to carry a child to term, or being forced to carry a child to term, compulsory pregnancy, in the case of abortion being illegal, is not just a neutral act that produces a baby that can maybe then be adopted or something. It's something that is a serious health commitment for the person carrying that child to term. And it's something that can in fact kill them and have a number of other dangerous effects. Far more dangerous than abortion, especially early term abortions, which have very few side effects and are very safe. There's obviously a quite heated debate over abortion, and there's a lot of philosophical considerations here in terms of whether it is ethical. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail, and you've probably heard many of these arguments before, but I want to give you just a few things to think about that you might not have heard about. First, although the debate we hear is between people who are on one extreme or the other, when we do surveys, we find the majority of people are actually somewhat mixed on abortion. So when you ask people about abortion, it turns out that most people think it depends on circumstance. Very few people think that abortion is never the ethical choice, no matter what, and very few people think that it's always the ethical choice, no matter what. Most people think it depends on the circumstances. one of the big debates here is fetal personhood. Is a fertilized egg, or as it develops into a fetus, a person? And let me just give you my sense of this. People obviously disagree. Certainly legally, the answer is that it is not a person. Medically, a baby and a fetus are different. A zygote, which is when an egg has first been fertilized and just begins to divide, it seems to me is very much unlike a baby, right? It has a few things in common, right? The DNA, that it's, living cells. But I think, common sense says we don't really think of fertilized eggs the same way we do about babies. And here's just a thought experiment. Imagine someone is in a fertility clinic, and the fertility clinic is on fire, and there's two rooms. In one room, there is a case with 5,000 fertilized eggs frozen in it. And in the other room, there's a 1-week-old baby. Right? I don't believe that in that situation, anyone would really save the 5,000 embryos over the baby, right? I think that our kind of common sense is that there's an important difference there. At the same time, what happens during pregnancy is that the zygote, the thing that is very much unlike a baby, becomes more and more like a baby, right? So a fetus right before birth is not a baby, but it now has a lot of things in common. So, we tend to think of fetal personhood, and obviously the law does, as a binary question, but it seems to me it's actually not binary, it's a process of change. All that said, though, the discussion about whether abortion is an ethical choice or not is a different one, and this goes back to what we talked about last week, between whether it should be against the law or not, right? So the question of whether the government should make that decision for people is really a question of government power, right? Does the government have the right, the power to make a decision about what happens inside your own body, what happens in terms of your medical decisions? And I would suggest considering the possibility that even if you believe that abortion is unethical, it might reasonably also be the case that a government that forces people to carry pregnancies to term, even if that person doesn't want to, is a very oppressive government. Now I want to talk about the legal question here, and for this we're going to consider 3 interconnected court cases, and they all relate to the right to privacy. I'd like you to think for a moment, do you believe that you have a right to privacy? I think most Americans do. It isn't said explicitly in the Constitution. The Constitution does leave room for the possibility of rights that they didn't think of. The framers of the Constitution understood that maybe they didn't think of everything. And there's certain things that suggest privacy in the Constitution, but it's not explicitly stated that you have a right to privacy. So the first court case is Griswold versus Connecticut, 1965. In the black and white picture here, the woman on the left is Griswold, and she was a nurse who was handing out information about birth control to married couples. This was illegal in Connecticut at the time. It was against the law to provide information about birth control, and so she was charged. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that we do have a right to privacy, that in this case, married couples' sexual practices, they had the right to get information about them from a medical professional without the government preventing that. That led directly to the ruling in Roe v. Wade, which is the Supreme Court case where they found that there is a constitutionally protected right to terminate a pregnancy. And so that right is based, again, on the right to privacy, right? The right to make a private decision with medical professionals about what happens in your body related to your reproductive health, without the government being able to control that. That said, Roe v. Wade, similar to the things I was talking about before, is not an absolute court case. It takes a balancing position where it says there is a right to terminate a pregnancy, but it's also permissible for the government to have some restrictions on that, some rules, about when you can terminate it, what kind of procedures are allowed, who can do it, and so forth, right? So it does balance that right. It's not an absolute right. It balances it with other interests from the government. The connection between birth control and abortion is very important here. So it might seem kind of intuitive that people who are against abortion or who want there to be less abortion would support birth control, because obviously birth control is effective in preventing unwanted pregnancies, which is kind of the direct cause of termination, right? But in fact, the people who have been against abortion or who wanted abortion to be illegal are pretty much exactly the same people that want birth control to be illegal. And this was certainly true in the 1960s. It's also, to some extent, true today. If you kind of look at the core elements of the pro-life movement, many of them are also pretty strongly against accessibility and availability of birth control. And so these rights are very much connected, both historically and in terms of how they are ensured for us. This right to privacy also connects importantly to sexual activities in terms of same-sex relationships. So this leads to the case Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. The two guys here that you see depicted were having sex with each other when the sheriffs entered their house. Lawrence is the older guy on the right there. It was his house, that's why his name is in the case. And they arrested them and charged them under what were at the time sodomy laws. And this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that Lawrence had a right to privacy. He had the right to have sex with whoever he wanted, consensually, in the privacy of his own home. And that, again, connects back to this right to privacy in the other cases. A couple of things about this case. First of all, sodomy laws, which I think I've talked about a little before, but were incredibly widespread in America. Originally, all 50 states have them. They've been slowly eroded, and in 2003 were finally gotten rid of. They didn't just cover homosexual sex. They covered a whole range of kind of sexual practices that were considered deviant, that were considered, immoral in various ways, including oral sex, anal sex, which the majority of anal sex is between heterosexual couples. I think it's also worth noting the race of the plaintiffs here. Although those sodomy cases were on the books in Texas, it was incredibly rare that they got enforced. For a start, I mean, it's rare that the police would catch you having sex in the privacy of your own home, right? In this case, their door was unlocked and the police entered. But also, I suspect the fact that this was also an interracial couple was a big part of why the police decided to pursue this case. That's not part of the law, but it is important to note here. And then, of course, Lawrence v. Texas leads directly to the Supreme Court cases in 2013, 10 years later, that legalize marriage for all people, that provide marriage equality. I want to take a step back and consider a theoretical question for a moment here, and that's the difference between rights and justice. So a right is a theoretical thing that you have a right to. We have rights in the Constitution, according to the Declaration of Independence. We have inalienable rights, meaning they can't be taken away, that come from the Creator in that document. But just having a right doesn't mean much if you can't exercise it. So you might have the right to free speech, for example, but if you don't have the power to get your speech out to other people, if you can't publish the things you want to say, that right isn't very meaningful. Another important example of this is the right to vote in the US. We talked about how African Americans, or people of all races, got the vote in America after the Civil War. But then what followed was a campaign of voter suppression. Now, throughout that campaign, the Constitution didn't change. Everybody still had the right to vote in the US. But in practice, the vast majority of people of color couldn't, in fact, vote. And so this is the question of justice. Do you have the ability to exercise a right? Do we have equal access to rights? So having the right to vote on paper doesn't mean much. What we need in that case is voting justice, the ability to vote. And we continue to have a campaign of voter suppression in this country, continuing that history of suppressing the vote for particularly African Americans, for Native Americans, and for people of color in general. And so this continues to be an important question today. Applying that to reproductive rights, we get to the question of reproductive justice. So the point here is that having the right to terminate a pregnancy is all well and good on paper, but it's not the same thing as having access to it, as being able to do it. And one of the things that you learned about in the film Reversing Roe is that there's been this attempt to make it harder and harder to get an abortion in America. Now, it will never be the case that it is impossible to get an abortion in America, right? Rich women in New York will always be able to get abortions, no matter how the law changes. The thing that actually changes is whether people with relatively fewer resources can get them, right? Do you have to travel far to go to a clinic? Do you have to go in for multiple visits because they have to do an ultrasound and show you the picture to try and convince you not to do it, or whatever law has been passed, right, where you have to sit down with a doctor and have them read you something that some legislator wrote or whatever. And if you have to take multiple days off work, if you have to travel potentially across state lines, potentially a long way to get to the nearest clinic, that's obviously prohibitive for some people, right? Abortions typically cost a couple of $100s. Again, for some people that's very easy to come by. For some people that is a massive amount of money that is impossible for them to get. And of course the laws in the US prohibit any public money going to abortions. So again, what that means is that in theory everyone has the right to terminate a pregnancy in the US. In practice, it tends to be people with more resources, people who are richer, people who are white, who have the ability to do it. There's some other important things that come under the question of reproductive justice. We've talked about the right to terminate a pregnancy, but an equally important right is the right to bear a child, the right to bring a pregnancy to term. And there is a horrible history of trying to prevent particularly Native Americans and women of color from having children. This involved a history of forced sterilization. This is something that happened until the 2000s in prisons in the US. But what would happen is doctors would have a woman come in, maybe she was having a child, maybe it was something unrelated that involved them looking at her reproductive organs, and they would sterilize her while she was under anesthetic without consent, without her knowing that it was going to happen. In some countries, including in China during the one-child policy, there were also forced abortions, which is obviously a horrific thing, the other side of the same oppression here, right? So that right to choose is a right to choose in both directions. It's the right to choose to terminate a pregnancy. It's also the right to choose to bring a pregnancy to term. And that right has been denied to people in the US historically. Another question connected to reproductive justice is where methods of birth control are tested. The hormonal birth control pill, in particular, was tested on women in Puerto Rico. They did sign consent forms, but there's evidence that they had very little, information provided to them. It was not informed consent. Many of them didn't speak fluent English. The doctors really kind of just steamrolled them, didn't provide them with follow-up. There were some deaths during that trial, and the doctors doing the trial didn't follow up on what caused the deaths, right? So if you do a test on 1,000 people or whatever, and you watch them for a year, some of them are going to die of other things, right? May or may not be caused by the drug you're giving them. And so normally when there's a trial like that, a drug trial, they very carefully try and figure out why the people died so they can find out if it was the drug or not. They just didn't bother to do that with the Puerto Rican women they were testing on. So it's important to remember that history in terms of who paid the price of getting us these medicines that we use today. Another couple of questions of reproductive justice is crisis pregnancy centers. I'm going to have you watch a video on this after this, but this is a fairly new thing. They've exploded across the country, and they are designed to look like they provide reproductive health services, but in fact they're propaganda machines that are trying to trick women, trick pregnant people from the possibility of getting an abortion, often trying to provide them with like propaganda about how they shouldn't, often providing them with lies. You'll see in the video. And that obviously, again, disproportionately affects people with fewer resources, right? Another question of justice is parental consent laws. Another thing that's gone into place is laws that mean that you can only get an abortion if you have the consent of your parent. For some people, they have supportive parents who are willing to do that for them. This obviously is something that affects people who are pregnant under the age of 18. For some people, horrifically, it is the parent who is the father of the child. The parent often, not often, but sometimes, is the rapist who has caused this pregnancy. And so having to get permission from your rapist to terminate your pregnancy is, a horrible thing to do to people. Again, a question of justice there. There are often kind of ways that you can get an exception to that if you go to a judge, but then the judge is kind of deciding whether or not this, young person that he doesn't know has the right to exercise their right to terminate the pregnancy or not. So another crucial question for reproductive justice is whether we're supporting people who do choose to bring a pregnancy to term. If someone has a child, are we just abandoning them as soon as that child is born? Do we lose all interest in this life that we were suddenly so concerned about? And in America, unfortunately, we're really bad at this. For example, almost every country in the world has paid maternal leave, meaning that a mother can get time off work paid to have a newborn baby, care for a newborn baby. It's an awful lot of work to look after a newborn baby. But the US is one of the few countries that doesn't provide this. And that obviously, again, disproportionately affects certain people. This map is actually a little out of date. Liberia changed its laws in 2016, so there's now only 7 countries that don't have paid maternal leave. Related to this is healthcare. Do we have free child support? Do we provide natal care, right? And the US has very disparate healthcare system where healthcare isn't provided to all people, despite, again, that being common in richer countries. And instead, we leave many people with little or no healthcare and no healthcare access, and that can have deadly effects on the children, on the mothers, on the parents. And this has very serious, in the US, different results by race. African American women are significantly more likely to die during childbirth in the US, to have a number of other complications from childbirth. African American babies have a higher infant mortality rate in the US because of the way that the healthcare system is racist and is economically prejudicial. Again, a question of reproductive justice there. The reproductive justice movement was started by women of color, And it's an intersectional movement. It understands the way that all these different intersecting identities around age, around immigration, around sexuality, around trans questions, are all come together to form the important web of reproductive justice, and that we need to work on these in combination. I want to talk a little now about eugenics. Eugenics is the belief that we can improve humanity through selective breeding, basically, that we can control which people have children. In some kind of slightly less harmful versions of this is about encouragement, right? So you try and encourage the right type of people to have children and discourage the wrong type of people. In the more oppressive versions of this is about sterilization, about laws that say certain people can't have children. Eugenics became quite popular and quite widely believed in round about the turn of the 1900s, leading up into World War II. It was, of course, practiced by the Nazis horrifically, and this led to, fortunately, most people realizing that it was a terrible, terrible thing, and today you see relatively few people who still believe in it. They do, unfortunately, still pop up, but most people understand that eugenics is wrong. I want to think for a little bit, though, about why people thought this was a good idea. And, many terrible things were done to people in the name of this. And if you look at the people who believed in eugenics, obviously some of them were Nazis, were fascists, but some of them are people we think of as, progressive, as good people. Margaret Sanger, who started Planned Parenthood, who was crucial in developing the birth control pill, believed in some eugenics ideas. Helen Keller, the woman who was blind and deaf and dumb, who famously learned to communicate, believed in eugenics, and was a radical progressive thinker in her time. And kind of similar people. And this is a good example how people who are trying to do something good, who are trying to improve society, can really get led astray by not considering their biases, not considering the effects of the policies they're advocating for. And I think this is an important lesson for us to bring today, that it is certainly possible for people with all kinds of values to end up supporting something that is quite terrible because they don't think through how people might be affected, how this will change with different levels of social power, and so forth. That's all from me this week. We have 3 more videos to watch. The first one, Fake Abortion Clinics, is about those crisis pregnancy centers. At the beginning, they ask people who work for the centers what they do, and they give their kind of propaganda answer. And so I encourage you to keep watching and not take that at face value, because they do an investigation. They find out that there's a lot of deception going on here, that, they aren't telling the truth. So, watch that through. Don't just believe the first thing you hear in that video. And then we have 2 videos from a series called The Vagina Dispatches. The first one is The Vulva. This is about the human body and has images of the human body in it. And then we have episode number 3, which is about the orgasm gap. The orgasm gap is the fact that it is considerably more likely that men will have an orgasm during a sexual encounter than women will, and they talk about some of the reasons for that. One thing that gets suggested here is the idea that female genitals or vulvas are somehow more complicated. I think that's just not true. I think what we think of as complicated or as difficult is socially constructed, is a reflection of what we're used to, and the motions, the things that it takes for someone with a penis to orgasm are quite familiar to us. They're kind of in the cultural understanding, whilst it is less common, although fortunately changing, that we have similar ideas of what is needed, and often in, sexual encounters earlier on, it's even more expected that only the person with the penis will orgasm, and so often people just don't have practice with vulvas. And so I think one of the things that's really going on here is a connection to some of the ideas we've talked about in terms of women being in a position of care, of service, of it being their job to provide for men in various ways, and this is one of those ways. So anyway, I think it's a pretty fascinating investigation, and enjoy those. We just have the material response on the quiz due Friday this week, and then we have 2 material responses for next week. We'll be talking about the kind of more modern part of the feminist movement, and the Me Too movement and so forth. And that is all for this week. We do have one bonus opportunity, and enjoy. I look forward to reading your material responses. Thanks.